It is a privilege to write about your own community, not just in the sense that it fulfills you, but in the sense that you actually have to have some sort of privilege. So as an Australian Aboriginal individual or a Torres Strait Islander, it means that you as a novelist have chosen a career path that likely will not end up in much success unless you become a best-selling novelist, which means that at some point in your life you choose to prioritize the fulfillment and possibly the fame over money. And this requires a certain amount of privilege that a majority of individuals do not have when they're writing about their own communities. So that's the first part of setup, characterizing who this individual is. You needed time to be able to do things like create the drafts, write the novel in the first place, and you can't do this while working a 9-to-5 job. Can't do this when you're doing menial labor. You probably also need money to do things like transportation, get to and from the city, get to and from different kinds of publishers, meet and greets with fans, making business connections to be able to further your novel into places that it hasn't reached yet. But it's also just a career choice in and of itself. It's very hard to make money as a novelist or as a writer, so you would have likely chosen finance or be a government worker or go into education if you did need money so much. So this person is likely a person of privilege from those communities. The second part of this characterization is that there's already a rapid trend of people within those communities, like Aboriginal communities, moving towards cities and urban life anyway because of more economic opportunities that end up there. So a lot of the youth, and likely this novelist, grew up in the city, or it likely has a lot of life experiences, and the most meaningful parts of their life are within urban life. So the last part of this setup is to discuss what it looks like to write about the different experiences of your communities. Note that maybe you are an Aboriginal person, but you cannot represent all of the experiences here. So what matters is how you're able to interpret them. When we're talking about city life, we are talking about two important parts of it. The first is the assimilation into the city and your identity when it comes to being an Aboriginal person and also a person of that country and of Australia. So it looks like talking about how perhaps you had to be able to invest into housing, even if it was incredibly hard to get. Maybe it's tattoos on the subway or the main train lines and people looking at you, or people in the grocery store judging you because your credit card declined. It's experiences like this and the assimilation of being someone from different parts of the community trying to integrate themselves in the city. But secondly, it is specific urban discrimination that exists that is very prominent. It is 29% of prisons being filled of Aboriginal individuals, 53% of youth detention centers, even if these Aboriginal people just make up 3% of the population. It's being able to highlight these instances of discrimination that exist the most in cities where people are likely to crack down on these communities. What it looks like to instead write about traditional communities, maybe to some extent you can talk about discrimination, but it has to be through different forms that the main majority of people are not familiar with. But more importantly, they don't really talk about assimilation or the average life of a person in the city. They talk specifically about the cultural practices of those communities, cultural practices that this novelist may not even be familiar with because they are likely a person of privilege. So there are two arguments that I want to launch. The first is that this is more fulfilling as a novelist to write about, and second is that you'll likely get better success. So I want to talk about the first argument. Why is it likely that you have lived in the city, or likely you have a majority of experiences in the city, or at least that you feel the closest towards talking about urban discrimination in the first place as a novelist? One is because, again, as I said, you probably don't have to prioritize money to invest and to be a novelist in the first place. There are very little starving artists in reality in the world because they cannot afford to be able to create novels in the first place. So assuming this person's career is writing, then that means that they likely have to be in the city to be able to publish, likely have to be in the city to be able to meet their fans or to be able to see their books on shelves. But secondly, even if they're not a rich person or too much of privilege, it's still likely that they were not living within these traditional communities in the status quo. Because if you're not living within these traditional communities, it would be very hard to be able to write your novels and be able to communicate directly with business operations from across the world. But also, if you're a person from those communities, there's more of a hesitation to share these experiences rather than if you're someone already assimilated into the city, you want to talk about how these mainlanders or how these individuals can relate to you more because you've already been or you've already talked to lots of Aussies or lots of people within the city, and you don't want to, you are more willing to share your experiences with them. So what does that mean for the process of writing the novel? novel. One is that you're probably representing experiences on the side of neg, experiences that are not so familiar to you. So it's harder to relate to traditional communities and to traditional cultural practices when you don't do them every day, when you aren't continuously doing things like farming with your community, when you aren't doing things like growing up with your community in that sort of way, like in rural areas where you do not have access to all of these things that you do have access to in the city. So it's hard to relate to these kinds of experiences. But second is that you have to go into these communities in the first place. And maybe you do have family there, but it's distant family. Your mom and dad are in the city and let you grow up there, but it's uncles and aunties that you did not know at all that are there in those communities that may not express as much care for you, or probably don't look at you as fondly because you choose to leave, or because you aren't as familiar with them, because you didn't grow up with them. So the important impact of this argument is, one, you feel a lot of guilt because you feel like you're either romanticizing or appropriating their culture. So yes, you are from that culture, but because you don't experience it every day, you feel guilty that you're representing it in this way. But second is that the community is not likely to feel like they're being represented by you. They feel like you're someone who was washed up and is a sellout and is just selling their experiences to other individuals. This has happened multiple times with multiple different authors. Even if you aren't one of privilege, they will still have backlash on you, and that hurts you. That feeds into the cognitive dissonance that you really aren't a person from that community. And lastly, the process itself is just not personal to you anymore. You don't get as much fulfillment. So that explains why you won't get fulfillment. I would explain why you won't get success with your novel. So assuming it is written well and there is no backlash for your community, it's just less palatable. There are two reasons on neg why it's less palatable. The first is that there's heavy stigma placed onto traditional communities, and of course this comes from like racism, but it also comes from very recent resurgences of this kind of stigma. Like in the 2000s, on how there were investigations into sex scandals or pedophilia that were probably just bogus, but they still did it, and a majority of the population believed that there was still pedophilia in traditional communities. So the novelty when it comes to newer stories is bad when it's stigmatized. But second is that it's harder for the middle class individual to be able to relate to you. And this is important. You need to be related to so that people can empathize with your experiences. They can identify, oh, it's also hard for them to pay for the train lines. It's also hard for them to pay for grocery bills. And the last is that it's just harder to expand these stories. You're always talking about cultural practices versus city life has a lot more different kinds of stories to tell of different kinds of identities and different kinds of careers. The important impact here is that, one, on a lot of the privileged Aboriginal readers that you will mainly have a fan base of, they're likely from the city already. The people with money, the people who are your fans, your biggest fans who want to read your work, are from the city and are privileged. So you're representing them a lot more on our side. They will come to your meet and greets, and then they will give you more money if you're talking about urban life. But second, it's just also middle class Aussies, middle class individuals who are better able to relate to your experiences, even if they aren't an Aboriginal individual. So what on our side does is that we talk about the very evident experiences of very relatable experiences for everybody, but put the important nuance to it. We talk about the urgent issues when it comes to politics, of one nation coming into power and talking about how protests in the streets are done by Aboriginal individuals. It's those kinds of experiences that make you feel fulfilled, that make you connect with your privilege and also your community.
Thank the first half for their final remarks. I'd like to invite first negative.
I think Side Affirmative underestimates how difficult it is to actually write and construct a novel. I think that the most likely characterization that should be used within this debate is to just explain that often these novelists do just actually work other jobs. It does, yes, take time to write a novel, but many just do it on the side. Yes, it does take a little bit longer in terms of time, but in some instances, this is just a passion project for them as well, that they work on the side to actually explore an issue that is particularly passionate to them. I'd further explain that contrary to what they say about being more privileged, we'd explain that often these are people who have a good, deep understanding of their community, many of whom do probably work as advocates or activists within their local community or have a background in history, and that is what fuels them to, I guess, explore, I guess, the novel aspects of like writing novels or stories, integrating their own historical understanding to create really powerful modes of historical fiction. We think this is probably the most likely group who are writing these. I'd also further note that like there is probably, contrary to what we hear from Side Affirmative in terms of it being so tactically difficult to write and produce these novels, we would explain that it's actually particularly, there is quite a lot of support for, I guess, Indigenous authors and novelists. There are things like, I guess, Australian book festivals that, I guess, appreciate First Nations authors, which explains why there is probably an increased likelihood that there is support to encourage the publication of these stories. Contrast to, I guess, the characterization you hear on Side Affirmative to explain why it's likely that only like people living in cities are going to be writing these stories. On characterization, we'd explain two key groups who are likely to, I guess, be these novelists. First, individuals who just know and understand their community. Contrary to what First Affirmatives say that they, live in cities, these individuals either actually are still living in traditional communities, or contrastingly, they grew up within these traditional communities and then moved, agreeing with the characterization of Affirmative to cities, but still have that deep historical understanding. Or contrastingly are part of, for example, stolen generations and are disconnected from their culture. But we explain that this is probably a good thing, because there is something powerful about where someone researches their own, heritage and traditional community, and encourages, broader community discussion about this issue, and facilitates engagement with members from that community to first of all bridge their own understanding about their community, but also publish a really powerful cultural story. Three things in this speech. First, on why it's likely to be done well, why it's better for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders empowerment, and third, on anti-colonial shifts. First, on why it's likely to be done well, 5 things here. First of all, we just explained that this is the first group of individuals who grew up within their community now have a greater capacity to actually explore and talk about traditional communities at a better rate. They have that experience, they have that understanding, and probably better than, mainstream, individuals and novelists who, are in a way, researching it themselves or drawing on, limited knowledge. We'd say even that's probably the first characterization, which even if that's not true and you buy their characterization about living in cities, we'd still explain that there's an extent to which they're probably pretty passionate about talking about their community. And there's something powerful also in integrating this historical research. But also we note that there's something also quite important in writing from a perspective which acknowledges limitations in their own view, that acknowledge that they don't fully understand the full traditional perspective of communities, but at least are providing, a page of this in terms of the broader historical history. So they're still contributing to, really important ideas. But thirdly, we'd explain that a novel form is one that is more fluid and less Eurocentric. And we'd explain here that it's, less, Eurocentric than other forms of writing, like essay and discursives. And this is why it's particularly powerful to integrate really historical, stories about communities who grew up in, traditional Indigenous communities. But fourthly, we'd explain here why you access modern stories. You can just access these modern stories they tell you about on-site Affirmative through things like feature articles or news stories or discursives, which are often shorter in length and capture, the powerful issues they talk about. Whereas we talk about how there's a lot more nuance on our side of the house, where you talk about, the deep history of communities. And these are better suited to a novel form. And then fifthly, here you probably just have a more range of community experience being given. That is to explain that there is such a huge array of different Indigenous communities that we capture them better on our side of the house compared to, what is quite moulded city experiences where individuals go to the cities and they're constricted by that way of living. We at least get a better integration of Indigenous communities' traditional stories where they've often been silenced in the past. Why now is it better for Aboriginal empowerment? Which I know you ought to weigh really highly within this debate, because it's both empowering for the actual novelist, but also particularly empowering for the broader Indigenous community. First here, we just explain that this increases self-determination, that first of all, a lot of the stories about traditional experience of Indigenous Australians were from, I guess, like a European settler perspective. That is, they often, as I think conceded by side Affirmative, like illustrate them particularly harmful with awful stereotypes. This provides more self-determination and autonomy for these individuals to provide their own experiences of their culture, either first-hand or experiences, or rewriting these stereotypes supported by this historical research I give you in characterization. But the second thing that I'd explain is this just increases racial pride. For example, it's quite analogous to movements, for example, in the 1970s, like the Black is Beautiful movement, which I guess encouraged like their own connection to their culture. Through, I guess, focusing on traditional communities, there's an aspect of learning and appreciating, I guess, your own like heritage and roots more, but also communicating and like empowering your broader audience that you've directed this to. And then thirdly, we explain to you that this just also allows education for those of stolen generations who didn't have this cultural experience. They explain to you the assimilation point. We explain to you why it's particularly important for individuals who have been part of this to, I guess, appreciate in a novel and I guess like often a form that experiments with like form and traditional features to engage with like the creative nuance of their culture and to actually understand it, both for their confidence and for the sake of understanding their community. Lastly, on why this causes an anti-colonial shift. And there are 5 things to explain here. First of all, if it is done well, as we tell you in my first argument, this just provides, I guess, historical and artistic merit to, I guess, aid in like, moving away from what is quite a very European-dominated like novel and fiction industry. A lot of our like fictional stories are just very based in one like settler perspective, particularly harmful. The next thing we'd explain though is a literary world just allows you to engage in culture a lot more than, for example, understanding like the city life. We'd explain here that, for example, there is a lack of, I guess, consistent Australian traditional experiences compared to city life. That is, we get like a deeper nuance and at least integrated more perspectives to appreciate. But thirdly, we explain here why we increase national pride and that we now have like add to our Australian literary canon by exploring something that is less talked about. I think we can understand that like city life is often quite dominated in terms of like urbanization and industrialization being talked about. What isn't being talked about are these cultural stories compared to things like they point you to about like experiences of urban life are just captured in news stories or feature articles. But fourthly, we explain to you that this just increases the ability to interpret collective universal experiences. And fifthly here, we just explain that often like traditional stories just have a language barrier and aren't translated to a specific, I guess, to a specific language, in Indigenous languages. This now allows these languages to be, written in English stories. So this increases the ability to actually comprehend it. For all these reasons, I am very, very proud to negate.
Thank you for extensive your final remarks. I'd like to invite the representative.
The first thing that I want to do is characterize who exactly this novelist is likely to be and why it isn't the sort of person that negative tries to paint. The first thing they say is that people who are novelists aren't rich. Many of them have these for passion projects and therefore work a side job. The first thing that I want to note is that prior to writing about anything, you are already considered a novelist, which means you likely have a track record of writing other books and making money off of them in the first place, and the fact that you're explicitly listed as a novelist probably means that this is your primary profession in the first place. But let's say you don't believe that. The fact that you self-selected into something like novelist and writing in the first place means a couple of things. The first is that you had deep connection that means you didn't have to care about material realities as much that allow you to transition into higher order things that people want. Individuals who are hungry find it hard to think about things to write, which is why, for example, many individuals who self-select into things like writing tend to be richer and more privileged by nature. The second thing they say in response, though, is that Well, these are people who may have grown up in traditional communities and therefore moved to the city. But this in itself is a concession. When you are a child, you cannot absorb the full meaning of many of these traditional communities and these practices. You cannot understand the meaning behind certain things, and you are oftentimes locked out from a greater portion of that culture because you are just a child. So when you move to the city before you have reached maturity and reached all of the other things that are part of that community, your knowledge is therefore incomplete. But I point out that in the vast majority of instances, many Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders who exist in the city are oftentimes immigrants whose parents came to the cities in the first place, and therefore they do not have any first-hand experience in the city. What they say then is that, well, there's knowledge to be imparted when you write from a limited point of view. That may be true for certain things, but in the case of something as sensitive as culture, when it matters a lot more to individuals who have actually existed within many of these traditional communities, you run a greater risk of being misconstrued, which is what Cara explains, which is why it's better to leave the speaking to those individuals in the first place. And they have those avenues. They've been invited to speak in Parliament on behalf of issues that affect them. They've been invited to speak on legal issues that give them legal rights to land. The existence of the Australian Aboriginal Committee and museums that detail traditional culture who want to give it respect exist on either side of the debate. The environmental movement fights to prevent these same habitats which are existent throughout the entirety of Australia. All this means that there are alternatives that explicitly deal with issues like environmental degradation and displacement and talk about avenues that allow for them to impart their stories. I point out the flip actually, that modern city living is a couple of things with regard to how hard it is to talk about it. One, the diasporic nature of communities in the city means that it's harder to create support systems, which means that when individuals feel struggle, they have less individuals to talk to it about, and it does not spread towards the rest of the community. Second, work in the city is isolating because individuals oftentimes have more packed schedules. They have to work significantly more, which means that sometimes they just don't have time to reflect very deeply on their experiences. But thirdly, there's a large degree of shame in imparting stories such as racism, because as the victim, there's an implicit shame that exists within many of these societies, and stories don't spread far enough. I think the implication is that many individuals who feel things like racism in the city, the 53% of youth detention individuals who come from these Aboriginal communities, feel like they are the problem, that their issues are invalid, that they are not symptoms of a system that was broken from the start, but that they were the issues and the individuals that were at fault. I think that this points to the fact that city stories are actually much harder to change under the comparative, and that these individuals are on the first hand of the racism that is experienced by many individuals within these states. Their response is, it's better to deal with this in discursive articles in newspapers. And here maybe this is fair, but I want you to ask yourself, what is the nature of discursive articles and newspapers in the city? The One Nation Party grew in significant prominence, won a couple of seats in the last election by tapping into pre-existing sentiments of monoculturalism and racism and amplifying them. The two issues here is the risk of this being the dominant norm with regard to how individuals see people in the city, because there is no dominant interpretation of how Aboriginals are seen, which is why you need the entry with a novel. And second is that individuals themselves feel guilty that this is the reason why they're being looked down upon. We fix this in two ways. The first is that a novel is powerful. One, people from your own indigenous community, which predominantly includes young people, by the way, who come in these communities and are the most likely to purchase books, read these novels from your own experiences, which Cara explains to be the most likely to be the most proximate, which is not only do you write better quality novels that get more sales, but it also means that you are better able to write about experiences that affect everybody. Like the credit card getting declined in the grocery store. The fact that your uncle, for example, got imprisoned. The fact that even if Aboriginal people make up 3% of the population, 29% of the prisoners in Australia come from those communities. Secondly, I point out that moderates with a reasonable amount of empathy also read these books. And here's how you can detail and disrupt the notions and monoculturalism that exists under their comparative. You humanize individuals in the city, because the counterfactual, when the individuals that you see and the way in which you interact with them on a prima facie level is through the news, is that when you see an Aboriginal person on the street as a white Australian, you see them as a dissident. You see them as individuals who are unsafe. You see them as individuals that you should stay away from, and the existence of novels that allow you to contest that reality is significantly more important than contesting realities in traditional communities that are by themselves insulated and have other means of fighting for their own because they have specific land rights, for example. But thirdly, I point out that there's an argument here on discourse. Maybe we don't change individuals on the extreme side on either end. But social media exists, and the topics that you discuss and bring up are what is brought up in the limelight. So you're bringing up stories of discrimination, of over-imprisoning of many of these individuals, of you, for example, having to stay at home to take care of your family because there is no social welfare. The fact that 45,000 indigenous families feel like they don't have suitable accommodations in the city. All of these are stories that you bring to the limelight, which are otherwise shrouded down in significantly more hatred that is brewed by the One Nation Party and increasing sentimentalism. I think what this points to is a comparison. Maybe there are problems that exist within traditional communities, but traditional communities are oftentimes consolidated and they have strong mastheads with regard to how they deal with issues. Diasporic communities in cities do not have that. They are decentralized, and therefore the little experiences that you can detail, even for a little amount of catharsis, is important to you, because besides what Cara explains, that you are more likely to come from the city or spend a significant amount of your time in the city or feel a lot of the discrimination and make most of your relationships in the city, the fact that many of the friends that you make within your indigenous community feel these things mean that you write this to feel better for them as well. The second thing is that it also places a direct comparison and pressure on their point. If it is true that cultural sensitivity, especially in the instances in which you don't know it, is far more risky, then that means that you should leave it to individuals who can actually tell these stories. Otherwise, you run the risk of these things being incomplete, which means you are encompassing of the culture, which means you're doing that negative. Or, in the case that it becomes offensive, it becomes the dominant norm and it becomes misrepresentative of the actual individual practices that exist within that particular state. But let's be charitable. They say, maybe you research into this topic, you have a deep interest, maybe you're an advocate. That is true. But I don't understand why this has to happen in the format of a novel. Many of the things they detail is positive. They say things like many of the things, like the practices in your community. How do you integrate this into a novel that needs a conflict at the heart, that needs many of these little stories to come to fruition if you only talk about things that are positive? On either side of the debate, you have Substack articles, you have Facebook posts, you can vote, you can use the money to actually fight for better indigenous policy, which is what they need the most right now. But you need to win first the cultural war that exists for the majority of indigenous people that are actively feeling racism and feeling discrimination in cities where they are excluded. At the end of this debate, it is clear. Even in the worst case where we have to take a trade-off about individuals who struggle in indigenous communities and individuals who struggle in the city, there are many other alternatives for that, and you are far more proximate to the individuals in the city since these are likely the people you eat with, the people that you are friends with, which means their problems probably matter more to you than individuals in traditional communities. But secondly, this also probably matters more to your parents insofar as traditional communities and other individuals have bigger say on what that might mean, which means that it is more important. But thirdly, we weigh it off based on scale. You are more likely to be popular, you are more likely to sell copies. This is a very clear affirmative win.
Thanks. Second up for their final remarks, I'd like to invite Nate to speak here.
The opposition attempts to tell you that these people who are novelists are going to be super privileged and like not representing of the like average experience of an Indigenous Australian. We think that this is actually, we agree with this characterization because in fact, but we don't think that this is a bad thing. We think that like the reason why these people are privileged is likely because they're a member of the stolen generations and because they were able to like they were forcibly taken from their homes and forced to assimilate into white society. We think that therefore there is a unique desire for them to try and regain back their culture and express it in an authentic way because they've been forcibly torn from it. They've suffered intergenerational trauma through being like robbed of the culture that was their birthright and are feeling a disconnection from their own communities. Yes, they may be able to like relate to like white Australians, but ultimately this is not the people they want to relate to because they're always seen as too black to be white. They're seen as like not possible to be able to represent white stories because they are seen as imposters who are accepted to the extent that it's useful for white political motives, but not accepted to the extent that people are actually going to want to relate to them. Therefore, we think that because of this positioning, they are likely to have a unique interest in making sure that they're telling these stories well and making sure that they're like consulting with local communities and also like putting passion and energy into representing it properly because they feel like the imposter and they are trying to make sure that they are being accepted. The other important stakeholder here is that it's like what mainstream Anglo-Australian societies. They don't know about Indigenous culture, Indigenous stories for three reasons. Firstly, that there's not enough of them because Indigenous people, as aforementioned, have been told to devalue their culture being members of the stolen generations. They don't feel confident enough to start talking about their culture and write narratives about them. So therefore, there's just a smaller quantity of them that are going to be there. Second thing is that white Australians might not be aware of Indigenous stories. This is because they're not seen, because again, the society doesn't see them as valuable. So therefore, they're being promoted less, and therefore they're not reaching the English curriculums and being taught on a mainstream basis. We think that the education system fails to teach about Indigenous stories because they're not seen as relevant to Australian life as the opposition says, and they're not seen as relevant to like the modern like city experience. So therefore there's not enough of a need to promote these stories to mainstream Australians. But then thirdly, there are just members of society who are overtly bigoted and don't want and just dismiss these stories because they don't see that they just think that Indigenous people are inferior. They mention the rise of One Nation and of monoculture. We think that therefore like this should be like we think that it's important that we consider moderating these perspectives because they are extremist and they are going to lead to the worsening outcomes for Indigenous people long term. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on interest, and secondly, on understanding and reach. Firstly, on interest, we provide you four main mechanisms for why we're likely to have more interest in Indigenous stories if they're told from traditional perspectives. Firstly, just that, as I mentioned before, there's likely to be passion going into it. When people are writing about culture, they're writing from either personal experience or from trying to regain this personal experience that has been robbed from them. Therefore, we think that there's going to be effort putting it into making sure that they're writing about these things well, and they're going to be writing about these things well. We think that passion translates to better writing for two reasons. Firstly, that you're going to be spending probably more time on the book. You're probably going to be wanting to edit it more, spend more on it if you're passionate about the things you're writing about it and making sure that you're portraying those things properly. And secondly, you're just going to be probably putting more nuance into it because you're going to be talking to people and trying to get their perspectives and having this unique desire to not misrepresent your own community. So therefore, you're going to get more things like nuanced metaphors which have more literary merit. Second thing we tell you on interest is that there is just a desire for authentic Australian stories. We think that the large majority of the Australian literary canon is written from an Anglo-Australian perspective, and we think that often these types of stories get discredited on a global basis because they're seen as a hollow imitation of the British mainstream stories. For example, one of the more famous Australian books, My Brilliant Career, is only praised in as much as it's able to show Victorian English society within an Australian feminist perspective. It's always shown in relation to how it relates to the British people that we're trying to represent. We think that for the average mainstream Australian, this is also seen as a bad thing because they want to have this literary heritage they're able to draw from and be able to relate to things that are unique to their Australian life, which is a multicultural one. So therefore, we think that there is going to be goodwill from the majority of mainstream Australians in wanting to have stories that are unique to them. The third thing is just on writing style. We think that that the novel form, as we tell you at first, is uniquely tailored to flexibility and inventiveness in writing style, compared to an essay, which is a lot more rigid and has like a strict structure for how it should be written. We think that fluidity and inventiveness increases interest because, firstly, like part of the value of like a novelist is being able to show the limits of the English language. If you're able to show that you're able to represent this completely disparate culture within the framework of a language that is traditionally oppressed it, that is just something that is like inherently impressive, and it shows like this hybridity of forms, which is just interesting. Second thing is just that like fluidity can mean that the story is told better. For example, The Great Gatsby is written in a uniquely inventive way using like unreliable narration. This unreliable narration way of writing, it helps further its messages of like disillusionment with the American dream and of like idealism of the main character. We think therefore that like if the story is written in a fluid way, which is able to like more authentically represent Indigenous languages and experiences, then it's going to be more interesting. It's going to be more interesting and able to convey its messages more effectively. Thirdly, just that like Oliver tells you that it's a hard thing to write a novel. We think that like if you're able to not only write one that is like moderately engaging, but write one in an interesting way, this is just something that is inherently impressive. We think that we think that Indigenous novelists will likely want to be doing this fluidity form because they're already writing in English and they're writing in a novel form, which is one created by the British. Therefore, there's like this desire to modify this form to make it more authentic to them, rather than just like be forced to write through this like framework which is not made for them. So why is it that interest is important? At the end of this class, we prove that we're able to get interest. This is important for two reasons. Firstly, money. It means that they're able to. It means that these people are able to increase their socioeconomic privilege and social position, and then maybe we trade off some level of money from the bigots, but we kind of don't really care anyway, because we don't think that these are the type of people who are going to be like whose minds are going to be changed by reading an Indigenous novel no matter what. And secondly, that it increases cultural connectedness in the community, which is particularly important for the stolen generation, who is likely to be these novelists that the opposition mentioned. Finally, then on understanding and reach, and so we think that we think that we're able to get better understanding of Indigenous stories for three reasons. Firstly, they tell you that firstly, we think that we can't understand the stories of discrimination in the cities that they mention unless you understand the thing that they've been deprived of. You can only care about assimilation if you realize that the writer has been assimilated. Therefore, we think their material about discrimination, about showing the impacts of discrimination, is contingent on there being enough understanding of the comparative world without discrimination. We think that there is a lack of this understanding unless you have more Indigenous stories, but because the education system prioritizes white perspectives, and because these cities. Because we think that the city narratives that these Indigenous people will be writing will be undervalued because they're seen as them just trying to imitate the white perspective rather than writing from their own perspective. Again, using my analogy before, you're seen as too black to be white, so these city narratives are less likely to be taken seriously. Finally, I think that there is an ability of relatability to resonate, because even if you can't resonate to the surface level city stuff, we care more about being able to resonate with the emotional perspectives and the importance of culture and these deep messages being said rather than the surface level stuff we both live in a city. That's why I'm proud to live in the
Just to make it for their final remarks, I'd like to invite the third affirmative. Thank you.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2. There's a reason why diasporas are so important to people, and it's because it has this extremely different experience from those who live lives from obviously their traditional families. The diasporas of people in China under the obviously life of Mao Zedong, and people who have been forced to move across places of Southeast Asia, immigrants who have moved to places like the West in the hopes of better dreams. These experiences are uniquely different in that you've abandoned your culture. You felt that this is something that was not important to you in the interest of your dreams. And most importantly, what this experience does is alienate you from your own people. It makes you feel like a fraud whenever you talk about their culture. It makes you feel fake whenever you speak over them, precisely because you understand that the experience that you have comes from either privilege or comes from a uniquely different context that means that you cannot talk about these people. It is telling that negative relies on attention to prove success and fulfillment. It's this idea that it is Eurocentric and there's little voice of Aboriginals on their culture, but your works are also completely funded by the government and also get massive support by individuals. The acknowledgement that you have a knowledge gap and you have the primary authority to take and interpret this culture over others who have lived their whole lives in these areas. That you write about the past over the present, where you are more proximate to people in the city. Very clearly, they thread the line that does not meet their burden. It is unclear why you care about this culture. It is unclear why you have the authority to speak over other individuals. Why you cannot just fund individual writers in these areas, do things like give them support, fight for policy in other avenues, or do things like post on social media. In fact, let's contend this. Their idea is that culture is better written in a novel and it deserves the amount of time and space and credence given in them. The first question is whether or not novels and writing are the primary means through which you should talk about culture. What we explain is that traditional life and culture are incredibly visual in nature, and it's why it's difficult for anyone, not just Aboriginals, to write about things like indigenous experiences, indigenous Filipinos, as opposed to creating movies and documentaries on their lives. And that's because being able to visualize a culture, see a culture that is so distinct and isolated and separate from city life, is uniquely a visual experience that people cannot just read on the books and interpret properly. But the second is that you have to put your voice over these things. Novels are unique in that they do not display the actual lives of these individuals. They are distinct from documentaries that can take clips of individuals directly talking about them, interviews of people taken from these lands and talking about their experiences with politics. It is uniquely putting your own thoughts and interpretations into writing, claiming that you are the central authority on these things without any actual impact. This is important because what this explains is the way that the life of these individuals in traditional areas is communicated is difficult to portray through words. Even if you believe all of the incentives, even if you believe all of the research and the history, the problem is that it's difficult to portray this in not only visually appealing ways, but also in accurate ways that are able to assess and ensure people are better able to understand your culture. And it's something as sensitive as this, very clearly, where it's again Eurocentric and stuff like that, it's difficult for you to overcome this barrier at the point of which there's a bevy of different people who are giving different interpretations. This is why novels are not likely to convince individuals. Even if you enter this sphere, it's not clear whether people would comparatively trust you over historians who have claimed decades of things like tenure, decades of things like research, decades of things like living on the land. The second is that you take these things from individuals. E.g., you just explain why this culture is something that's massively different from you. The second idea is on proximity. The closest analogy to what you experience is probably around like second-gen immigrants or Asian immigrants in diasporas abroad. You feel like a fraud, which is even worse for members of the stolen generation like they explain. Aboriginals who are picked from their families, put in white communities with the interest of them forgetting their own culture. This is absolutely terrible for you to not talk about your city life and the experiences that you have. One, because you feel stripped of your culture already, but you never also lived in that area. You don't know what city life is like there because you were literally taken from your families and moved to these places. You've never had proximate experiences with them. Your family is someone that's forgotten. You don't have any connections with that area. The second is that you actively talk over members of the community themselves. Talk over individuals who have lived in these places for their entire lives. Individuals who are more proximate to that culture and are better able to represent their culture over you. In fact, the disconnection of culture is better written through the lens of the city. You talk about the lie of the Australian dream and the failed historical equities that they tried and promised these indigenous people. It's connections that are taken away, which is uniquely something irreplaceable even with the city's lives. It is the difficulties of being stolen and experimented on to just be whiter. These are more proximate to you because you talk about city life and how difficult it was to assimilate. Their contention is, how can you talk about culture? How can you talk about the lives of these individuals? In the same way, you can still talk about the struggles that you've experienced with reconnecting, how city life has taken away this identity from you, and how people have stripped this capacity for you to restore trust in your culture, to restore connection with families that were taken away from you. It is unclear the lines of whether or not you can talk about the struggles of reconnection, the struggles of what culture mean to you. The only difference that we explain on their comparative is you don't talk about individuals' lives in these areas, talk about what they experience in their cultures, which is uniquely different. The second is that resonance, they say, is equal to appealing to white individuals, and it's unclear why you're called not an imitation and stuff like that. The first thing we explain to you is even in the absolute worst case, it is just good. People at the very least relate to these things, and that's fine, right? What we explain is even if you're called an imitation or you're called a fraud on either comparative, you are called out for calling out the government, you're called out for calling white elite individuals. On the absolute best case, it is at the very least people relating to this story, people relating to the experience of people in the diaspora, at least having some proximate connection to what city life is like, and being able to think about what we talk about immigrants and how we treat them. The second is even if people clown on it, they talk about it and buy the book. Versus theirs which doesn't get traction. It's just like, why am I interested in Aboriginal culture? Why would I care about these individuals? Very clearly, at the very least, what you can explain is why the experience of immigrants, the people who are close to you, individuals in the city who are the most proximate to you, but don't actually talk about their experiences to that extent, are pretty important and proximate to you. So at the very least, even if it's negative, at the very least, we get more traction and attention, which just generates things like discourse and stuff like that. The last thing is a contextual on things like Eurocentric, talks and whatnot, and whether or not you can actually talk about culture and avenues and stuff like that. The contention from Sam is clear. People have other avenues to talk about things like culture, to talk about politics and life within obviously these traditional areas. This is asserted. Here are the different sources. It is 1. Empirically, environmental movements which fight to preserve these same habitats. The existence of the Australian Aboriginal community and museums that detail traditional culture. Communities that are headed and isolated by these individuals, which just explain why this maybe has more space in politics, maybe has more space in visual media, not at all why you as a person who didn't have any meaningful connection to these places probably prioritize your proximate communities within the city, probably relate and can feel like you have more authority towards your experiences in the city because you experience these things. What happens on their comparative? You talk over individuals who obviously have more proximate experiences, rather than funding them, rather than supporting them, rather than going back to these communities and giving back to them. It is unclear why you have the authority to write about these novels, why you don't feel like a fraud in a world in which you were taken away from this culture, why you feel like you are right, and why you feel like you are fulfilled. All of these reasons propose.
Affirmative for their final remarks. I'd like to invite the negative and the constructive portion of the debate. Here.
Racism is bad. Yeah, opposition team, we already know that. We already know about all the things that the Aboriginal people are going through because, like this opposition says, they know the stats about prison statistics of Aboriginal people. They know about the stories because they see the interviews on the news. We all know racism is bad. What we do not have is the unique lived experiences of these people from these communities, these unique cultural experiences that they have in these different communities, because no, there are hundreds of different Aboriginal communities with their own unique histories and cultures. These are the things not being heard. So while they might be able to claim some racism, no, this is not a unique benefit, because the news is the best way to do this. These short sentences that explain the things they're going through, these interviews that make you feel how bad these things are racism is already known to be an issue. What isn't known is the unique cultural experiences that we give you on our side that these people care deeply about. 3 things in the speech then. Firstly, on the characterization, what type of people are there? Secondly, on the cultural representation, what is the most important thing? And finally, on success. Firstly, on the characterization, I just want to make it really clear. This is not an especially privileged person who just lives in the city and has like a bunch of money and privilege, right? Obviously, this is probably just a normally privileged person who probably still does have a deep connection with their country. How do they try to give the justification? Firstly, they say they must be rich people because all authors are rich and they need money so they can survive. A few responses. Firstly, most people get into authors as a job because they enjoy writing, they enjoy books. Like, look at history, a lot of authors who are especially famous died in poverty because they just enjoyed writing, because like they did it for the thing, right? But secondly, I just explained to you that richer people are often pushed away from writing into more lucrative careers like finance that they talk about because writing is often seen as unprestigious. That is just explained so that you're probably going to see more poor people because they don't have these pressures to follow the same jobs as their parents. Secondly, they say, hey, they have to be rich because they can't have, like, they need to not have a job. Note that you can still have a job and write, right? A lot of teachers do that. Like, you have 200 days of work, you maybe mark for a bit, but then you can write your books in your free time. You can write books outside of that. Obviously, you can have 2 jobs at once, right? Finally, I just note that, like, their mechanisms about publishing being extremely expensive don't work because of things like self-publishing. It is extremely cheap to publish a book, and with things like AI, it is especially less time-intensive to write a book. That is just explained that they don't have to be super privileged, like this opposition team talks about. Finally, they try to rely on the info site and say they're a novelist. Note, you can have 2 things. You can be a climate activist and an author. Just because you have one title doesn't mean you can't have anything else. And secondly, note that this doesn't mean they're especially successful. Lots of people claim the author title without being like a successful author just because they like publish a book. Secondly, they say these are likely privileged city peoples, but I just want to note that even in this best case, they still have a lot of connection to culture. I give you 3 mechanisms in response. Firstly, native title often needs ongoing connection. That is just explained that lots of these communities still do have an ongoing connection. Secondly, stories are often passed down verbally through generations. That is just explained even if they do live in their city. Their parents or their grandparents are still telling them stories that they still know about them. But finally, we tell you that often they go back to their families just to talk about it. Like, I go to Vietnam back in the holiday so I can talk to my family. Obviously, you still have some level of connection even if your main experience is in the city. Also, I just want to note that it's nice all their benefits about like changing the privilege, because if these are the most privileged and wealthy people, then obviously there is a very little delta. The thing that these authors probably care most about is fixing the things in these smaller communities that have more discrimination. Obviously, they're still going to be talking about these stories. Unclear why they would want to change something if they have like this like super high privilege. But I just want to note that you're all the way this low. Even if you believe in some instances it is people in the city, note that like there are just a large array of people. The fact that they talk about Aboriginal authors in these rural communities just implies, like funding rural authors in these communities, just implies that you do believe there are some there. Okay then. Firstly, on the representation of culture, we give you a very simple claim. We tell you that they talk about the unique stories in their places that they care the most about, because this is where they get the most change. They can fix misunderstandings and immortalize their narratives that otherwise would have gone extinct. Perhaps the stories of their parents or their grandparents that no one else knows about. This is a unique benefit that we can claim. We tell you that even if it doesn't succeed, it's cathartic to write about these stories, to write about what your parents are telling you, to talk about these stories that you were raised up on. These are things that we care deeply about. What did they say? They say you can talk about discrimination in these novels, and that you can like fix discrimination because of that. A few responses. Firstly, their own mechanisms about news and stuff. These are obviously the best channels because they're much shorter. So like you all believe that if this doesn't exist, there is just a bunch of information. But I'm going to give you 5 mechanisms why this is a particularly bad one. Firstly, it is hard to integrate. Like they say themselves, often narratives have to have a catharsis, a good ending. That is just explained that the ending of the book is probably positive. So it knifes all their things about discrimination, because it shows that there probably is a good ending, so it doesn't make it clear. Secondly, if you're trying to be extremely didactic about stats and stuff, it is just hard to integrate well in a novel. That is just explained that you're probably not going to see crazy amounts of like sadness and like horribleness, because it is just a sad book that no one would want to read. But secondly, we just flip this. It probably just does undermine the stories about racism in the news, because you have to have a happy ending in your book because you're following these structures. Secondly, I just want to make an observation that even if they want to bring catharsis or talk about discrimination, they can just go to the news and do interviews. They can just talk to their friends. This is not something that is incredibly important. Thirdly, why alternative sources are better. We explained to you that essays have a factual basis, so they aren't forced into these narrative structures that cloud the discrimination. We tell you interviews are much shorter and get much more engagement, because they can pop up in your reels, they can pop up in the news, and people engage in it without having to buy a book. And I just want to make the final observation that racism about these Aboriginal people is just well known. This opposition team knows about it, everyone knows about it. This is not something we all care about. But fourthly, this is just nice when they talk about it being extremely privileged people. Obviously, the biggest change is it's when you help these people who don't have their stories told at all. This is what we care the most. Finally, they try to say that our side won't work very well because you need pictures. Firstly, just note most of the stories are oral, that it is an oral tradition, you pass it down, so obviously if you wrote it in words, it would still convey pretty well. But even if you don't believe that, you can probably just put pictures in books. This is just explaining that we can tell stories that are unique, that do matter to communities, and this is what you weigh the highest, because they know that if they do not write it, their stories will be erased. They know that if they don't write about racism, then someone else is going to talk about it. It's not that big. This is the biggest incentive. More mechanisms on why the discrimination is unlikely to go well. But another mechanism is just that the people don't have to internalize it well. Note that oftentimes these are stories, so they might just internalize it as a story of what happens as opposed to factual sources like the news. But secondly, often when someone is complaining about their life, regardless of where they're from, people just don't buy into it that much because they are seen as an unreliable author. That is just to explain that they're not going to internalize the struggles, but say this is how people feel about the struggles. So it's unclear why this actualizes change, so it's unlikely to bring any of the change. Note that we have a certain benefit of telling a story because it is out there, because we can now see about it, it is immortalized. Finally, they say misrepresentation about these stories, and you can ask other people. Firstly, who are these other people? Those are other authors, of course, so you're obviously as an author yourself, you should probably talk about it. 3 mechanisms. Finally. Firstly, there's not a homogeneous group. There are hundreds of communities with each their own stories. That's just explaining that it's extremely hard to find another person to talk about your story specifically. It's extremely hard to tell even if it's inaccurate. It's probably fine. Secondly, it's just Secondly, you can still talk to people within the community to ensure accuracy. You're probably still friends and family who live in that community who know very well about these stories. It's unclear why you would just write it yourself. Obviously, you talk to people who know better, or you talk to the people who you were planning to fund on the opposition team side. But secondly, thirdly, we just tell you that even if you believe it is a misrepresentation, this is something you shouldn't care about because it is the author's misrepresentation. It is the thing they know the story as, and they want to spread their own view of the story. It's normally a personal story. Okay, finally then on success, and why is this the least important metric? Firstly, I just want to know our things aren't contingent on it because you are just writing the story, you are getting it out. People can access it thousands of years in the future. But finally, we just tell you that you're more passionate and there's a gap in the market compared to the racism where you can have it there's no uniqueness. That is just explain that success is not the most important thing you should care about. You should just care about the culture and expression of it. So proud to negate.
Your next further final remarks, I'd like to invite the reply to the speech.
Oh, okay, yeah. Three questions to ask in this reply. First of all, what does this novelist look like? Affirmative try to explain that this novelist is privileged because they probably are individuals that have been titled as a novelist and they have that experience and have developed that over time. Or secondly, that they just likely live in a city. We provide two opposing or different ways of interpreting this characterization. To first explain that they probably either A, lived in the community and then moved to the city for similar financial incentives that Affirmative tell us, or they are just members of stolen generation, for example, second generation who have just grown up in the cities and are wanting to understand their culture better. This explains on our side of the house why we get stories which are just particularly passionate, where people care about understanding their history and want to share the importance. This is something you ought to weigh particularly highly, because first of all, it is particularly empowering for these individuals who are disconnected from their culture to understand it. But secondly, it is probably more likely that they are activist-based, they have integrated historical understanding, or because they are passionate about the issue, take the time to integrate historical understanding into their actual work. They interview individuals within local communities to bridge their knowledge gap because they are particularly value actually putting out authentic stories. The second thing to explain is why we win on quality of stories. And at no stage do they actually explain to you why these city stories they explain are particularly important, are best suited to novel-based approaches. We explain why there are just news articles, for example, that capture these more clearly. But for example, that you can just gain, that the best way to, I guess, gain an understanding of these city experiences is to understand the actual context of the person who is providing this story. And that is probably more suited to a, I guess, feature article, discursive or news-based story, which provides context on who the specific individual is who is giving this experience. Yes, we explain why it is best for these as short texts that, I guess, like capture these experiences in a quite, I guess, matter-of-fact way compared to, I guess, a novel, which is able to capture deeper nuances. To little response, we explain why it is actually particularly good for preservation of unique communities, noting that there are hundreds of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities within Australia, and that it is particularly important to, I guess, like counteract what have been, I guess, like agreed on both sides, colonialist perspectives and stereotypes within traditional novels that paint pretty big stereotypes about how Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander individuals act and are. We rewrite these by, I guess, integrating stronger cultural perspectives, stronger understanding of, I guess, like traditional communities. The main response is to explain that if you live in the city, it's like inappropriate to, I guess, appropriate something you don't understand. I think you only can buy that if that is contingent on them have never lived in these communities. So if you buy my characterization as to why they are likely to have lived in it at least a little bit, that explains why you will not buy this characterization and instead buy what we tell you about why there is a layer of authenticity. But even if you don't buy that material, we still explain to you why these stolen generation people, members of the stolen generation, probably do have that incentive to write their story to justice, to actually explain this like their cultural phenomenons in a good and positive way, to actually articulate it but empower themselves and bridge their disconnection. So you all buy why these stories are probably higher quality. They say we take away from the authentic view, but that doesn't engage with the fact that there are hundreds of different communities which just aren't being explored, are being lost in the process, language and cultural traditions being lost, but also doesn't engage with the fact that they say that, oh, we're silencing other voices. The issue is that there just aren't a great amount of these voices being shown in the first place. At least we are getting them out and providing very important ideas. But why do we prove engagement? And I always weigh that unique stories that appreciate broader cultural practices are ones that are easier to engage with, compared to, for example, what is an over-domination of city-based issues within novels. These are unique stories that are likely to sell better and, I guess, engage Australian audiences who are particularly interested in the culture. But second of all, we explain to you that it's likely for Indigenous Australians to accept stories of stolen generation, noting that it's actually quite powerful for stories to acknowledge their own limitations. So at the end of this debate, you should appreciate the importance of actually understanding culture. And for all those reasons, I am very, very proud to negate.
Thank the speaker for their opening remarks. I'd like to invite the Affirmative to close the debate. Here.
Racism is bad. That goes to show that their entire case is as flimsy as this response to ours. They say, and every single part of their mechanism to explain why you are likely good at being able to represent these stories is simply that you will it to be. Even if you have privilege, you can talk to these communities. You can make them hand over their experiences. When we explain to you that the likely case is if you are separated, if you are a stolen generation, it's very hard to be in touch with these communities, and there's a hesitance to want to be able to share these experiences with you because they do not know you. And even if you are family with them, even if you are friends with them, it's the fact that maybe they are hesitant to want these stories to be brought out to the bigger markets. As we characterized in first speaker, they don't explain the likelihood of why these communities are going to be so comfortable with you talking about these experiences, especially if you're distant from them. They don't explain the likelihood that you are even from these communities and grew up with them. So the first thing that they say is that you are stolen generation, or that you grew up with these communities in the best case, and you want to share these experiences because it's cathartic. And their only proof as to explaining why these people aren't privileged is, well, you can work many jobs, you can enjoy writing. Look at this analysis. This proves you are part of the privileged privileged class, you enjoy writing instead of being in the traditional community that doesn't tend to write, that does more communal activities, that does more traditional activities. You work jobs, again, not part of the traditional community, like you are in the city working those jobs. So all of this characterization proves that you are probably working in the city. Maybe you aren't the elite person that we said, but you are still not a person relative to those traditional communities with those same experiences. And what they needed to prove was not that this person wasn't elite. They needed to prove that this person was capable of representing these experiences. So they were unable to do this. The second is that they had to explain why it's specifically this form of media that needed to be represented through tradition, that had representation for traditional communities. Their biggest claim for our side is, well, you can just read the news, guys. Well, clearly that hasn't fixed anything, right? The reason why you need novels is to humanize individuals. Statistics are just numbers, but when you write about these people, you can tell their stories. The last-ditch effort at WIP to say that you will only write happy stories is clearly just misrepresenting the vast majority of our case when we actually illustrate to you what it looks like to describe urban city life, where you don't have to have a happy ending to a story, but you just have to display these instances of criminal abuse towards these people of different communities. It's specifically these illustrations that you need to be able to buy, because look at the comparison. What the heck is their illustration for their case? What does it look like to write a novel about the traditional community? What is the conflict? What do you even want to intend to do? Is it just a white person, is it just a stolen generation person talking about their experiences? That's going to get all of our harms about backlash, all of our harms about this isn't even cathartic. Because the last thing here is that you need to weigh at the end of this. Even assuming you get catharsis from writing about reconnecting with your community, you can get that through a vast majority different of ways. You can do that by investing in them, advocating for them if you are an activist. Why do you have to write about them specifically? Because there's a short-term amount of catharsis that you can get from writing about connecting with your community. But there's a vast majority of your life experiences that you spent as a novelist living in the city and seeing these experiences. And there's a lot more political will for it, that you need to be able to connect with the diaspora that is disconnected, that you need to be able to talk about these experiences, especially when it comes to politics, because that's what your effort is, to be able to connect to the people around you and to be able to do justice for other Aboriginal people. So we explain why, one, you are likely more fulfilled because you are better representing your own experiences, but you're also being able to be part of the culture war in the most important ways. But secondly, why you're also more likely to be successful. And by the way, all of that material is untouched. Like, they just explicitly agree with all of our mechanisms on how it's unpopular to want to write about these stories. So clearly, on the widest of margins on how racism is bad, we clearly win.